Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Philip Levy.
All right, well, thanks for coming. Lovely view, and I'm glad everybody was able to eat a bit. I want to say a couple things about what I'm going to talk about and then sort of launch into it and give you plenty of time so we can have a little bit of back and forth toward the end. This is an encounter, let's use that nice word, with a scholar. And I want to make a distinction right away between an encounter with a scholar and an encounter with an enthusiast, because there are differences. And what I want to do, because we're talking about this from the lens of a scholar, is I want to kind of play the game that we always play when we do this, which is taking things apart. That's what scholars do. It's not just that, particularly as historians, it's not just that we know a lot about a particular place and time, but more importantly, what we know and what we teach, what we do in the Department of History, what we do in the College of Arts and Sciences more broadly, is study and focus on how we know what we know, which is a crucial distinction between knowing things and knowing how we know them. So understanding how we know stuff is vital. It's partly why historians go on to become such great lawyers and doctors and legislators and so on and so on. Because the major is all about understanding how knowledge functions. We use historical information as our source base to play that out, but really what we're interested in is the how. Why do we know these things? Why is it that we come to know certain things? Now, with that said, as Dean Eisenberg showed you a little bit, my research work actually is about other things. I deal right now a lot with George Washington's childhood, which is actually, as in this book that I've just written and another one I'm in the middle of writing now that just went under contract last week, is really a 300-year-long story. It's much larger than George Washington. And I deal with these issues of landscape and memory and how people understand things over time. But that's not the only thing I teach. I teach a lot of other things. And I put together a course a few years ago on Atlantic pirates. And when I was approached to do this talk tonight, we thought that the pirates made sense, even though it is not my specific research field. So I'll talk to you as someone, as an 18th century historian, who deals with the issues around the pirates, but I am not specifically an historian of pirates. Although I should say, just for clarification, that my Vita does contain an article I wrote a little while ago about a particular mutiny and maritime cannibalism incident in the 1530s. So I have a little bit of a tendril of research in this. I've written a little bit about maritime disaster, which is sort of the strength on which I started teaching this class. But the reason that it's fun to talk about the pirates is not because of who the pirates are. That's what I want to do. I think I said in the elevator on the way up. My goal tonight is to try to take away some toys. I want to break some of your favorite little toys. I'd like to challenge what you understand about stuff and hopefully make Gasparilla a lot less fun, right? That's the idea. Really kind of pull the plug out from this a little bit, because part of what's so much fun about pirates is not what they were in the 18th century, but rather why it is that we talk about them the way we do. And if you could imagine, I start my pirate syllabus, and I hope I'm not going to be too brazen, but I start my pirate syllabus with a little vision. And I say, imagine 200 years from now that it's the September 11th Terrorist Day parade. And there's all kinds of fun stuff that goes on. You've got little floats of, the Twin Towers and airplanes, and you've got people dressed up as terrorists, and it's really quite enjoyable. And saucy terrorists, because terrorists are, a little sexy, right? The notion is absurd to us, offensive to us, right? Completely outside of our acceptable bounds. However, if we were to talk to people from the early 18th century and present them with what we understand pirates to be, they would be horrified. Absolutely, utterly horrified. Because what you're really talking about, and the first thing we have to understand, is that we're talking about a very short, because this really only happens within about 2 decades, what we tend to think of, the captains with the big coats, all the stuff that Hollywood has liked, happens only in about 2 decades, and affects many people, but we're talking about the number of actual so-called pirates in the range of about 2,000 people. It is a very small, very short crime spree. And that's about it. It's a crime spree. In fact, there's a continuity. People robbed ships as long as there have been ships at sea. Some of you may well know that they are still doing it, right? Some of you are very much aware of this. We don't think of people in Somalia as having a language and a code and an ethos and, and just being kind of interesting in and of themselves. We understand them basically for being what they are. Opportunistic thieves. There's money available by capturing something. I'm going to take it. I'm going to make a little bit of money, and then maybe just blend back into the woodwork, as it were, right? This doesn't become a way of life. It becomes a short career choice. Well, when we start to understand the pirates of the 18th century, we need to keep all those things in mind. We need to understand that we're dealing with people who were, who were in a particular context, who are not what we tend to invent them. I'm going to kind of conclude toward the end about how we get there. But let's stick with who these folks are to begin with, so we can dismantle some of this and kind of get a closer handle. Everything that we tend to think of as fun and exciting about the pirates is really, and you didn't know this, but hopefully you'll start to see this way. If you find the pirates interesting, do you know what you really find interesting? The 18th century. That's really what you find interesting. You didn't know that. But the pirates become a distillation in the 19th century and in the 20th century of a whole bunch of different symbols and issues and images that are about the 18th century, that are issues that play out within the 18th century. They're not located specifically within pirates. For example, who has parrots? What is the parrot a symbol of? Right? We all know it in one particular idiom. Who has parrots? The parrot is a symbol in the 18th century. It does mean something into the 19th century. It's a symbol of whom? Would you want to venture a guess? Sailors. It's just sailors. It's people who went to the tropics, and the boat found an interesting tame bird that they traded for something, and it ends up on a ship. So to show a guy with a parrot in the 18th century is just to suggest that the man is a sailor, which is a growing subclass of people in early 18th century Britain. Britain has gained control over the slave trade in this period. The British Navy is expanding. So more and more men are being put to sea in Britain. We'll cover that in a moment. More and more men are being put to sea. They're a growing minority and a very influential and important one within British society. So there are more and more people being drafted into this process. There are more and more people participating in it. And more people have little things like parrots. To lose an eye, to lose a hand, to lose an arm, to lose a leg, to see a peg leg, is a symbol of what in the 18th century? Again, a very powerful symbol. Look at your Hogarth pictures. You'll see illustrations of this. You know what that's a symbol of as well? Same thing. A sailor. A sailor. Nothing more than a sailor. Sailing is an incredibly dangerous job in the 18th century. There is an enormous likelihood that you'll be knocked off and drowned, and that would be on the lucky side of the range of harms that could happen to you. It is a dreadful experience. So dreadful, in fact, that the British government broadly, over the end of the 17th century and in the early 18th century, starts to really retool their legal system so as to be able to push more people into this process. Britain, first of all, I love to ask my students this, so I'll ask you this question. How many capital crimes are there in the United States today? My students never know the answer. I know you guys know, you're just being bashful. How many capital crimes? They can execute you for how many crimes? 2. 2, and they are what? First degree murder, and the second? Treason, that's right, excellent. So those are the 2 you can be executed for. In early 18th century Great Britain, in the range of 150. It's Jean Valjean time, right? You steal a chicken, they can kill you. You shoot a deer, they can kill you. And they do it. And part of this has to do with the rise, a very complicated story that's in the background of understanding piracy and understanding why this is an 18th century story that we've sort of boiled into one little character type. But part of what's happening is the rise of the notion of private property. It begins in the 16th century in many ways and carries on through. It has a whole series of issues. The Protestant Reformation in Great Britain plays a role in this. Sort of transfer from the usufruct, the public property, to private property. It takes a long time for people to grasp this idea that you are simply not allowed to put your sheep there anymore. You had been able to put your sheep on this land for generations and generations, and you were able to live well because of it. After a period in time, you're not able to anymore. The rise of private property and the economic systems and legal systems that enshrine private property, that's happening in the 18th century. We think of it as the way we live. It is the way we live. It's normal and natural to us. But there is a moment when it has to be developed. And the process of developing it is very ugly. A lot of people have to be killed before people start to say, you know, I'm not going to take those cabbages anymore. I don't want that fence there, so I cut it down. But then they come and they kill me, and you know, the next people say, well, maybe I won't cut the fence down, right? It takes a lot of that kind of activity. And in that process, In that process, there are people who are, for lack of a better word, use a very English word in this, dissenters. People who disagree with this process. And so you get archetypes that come up in the English popular mind. Those people who challenge those systems. We know the pirate. The other one that's much less significant to us as Americans, but because the pirates happened on our side of the Atlantic. But if you know your British popular culture, or dare I say it, your carry-on movies, with Sid James and, Hattie Jock. Do you know the carry-on movies from the 60s and 70s? There's another character type analogous to the pirate that's very popular in England, but we don't know them so well. Do you know who that is? The highwayman. Someone said it, right? The highwayman. And the highwayman is these Robin Hood figures. We have them in the form of people like Bonnie and Clyde. The people who sort of rob the man, to use euphemistic speech, to sort of, for some benefit, or sticking it to, right? So part of this sort of even the visibility of these people has to do with this much broader problem of the rise of this notion of private property and the legal systems that enshrine it and people's resistance to it. So there's an element of folk hero precisely because these people seem to stand out against it. Another thing we need to understand is that this is an extremely hierarchical world. Most of us as Americans would not be happy there. We would not be happy with this world. Apart from just a capital crime, we would not be happy. Deeply hierarchical. Everyone sits in relation above and below to someone else. It gets called the great chain of being. And it's a hierarchy. It goes all the way up to the crown, and the crown sits subservient to God himself, right? Who is, of course, a member of the Church of England, as everybody would know. But it's deeply hierarchical. Everyone has a master. Everyone. Even the king, although that master is God. There is an enormous fear in this society of what get called, in this time, this early modern era, what get called masterless men. There's nothing scarier than the masterless man. Those men who do not sit within the hierarchy. Those men who have slipped the leash of authority, and therefore in the 18th century, there's no way to control people. I mean, I talk about this with folks all the time when we talk about these things to try to conceptualize this early modern era. We, contemporarily, are some of the most well-disciplined, well-policed human beings that have ever existed. We are the great anomaly. We are the odd ones. Most of us, honestly, if we're honest with ourselves, don't even know how to grow a carrot for dinner, right? But generations of people have known this. We are the odd ones. We also are very heavily policed. We police ourselves. We have the internal police officer. And that police officer is there through our credit ratings and through our mortgages. Any number of different little, if you will, choke chains apply to us. We police ourselves. Now, I'm not necessarily critiquing this negatively. It also produces an incredible amount of harmony, right? It's a very good system in that respect. It's not there in the 18th century. You don't have that. If someone wants to change who they are, if somebody wants to reinvent their identity, if somebody wants to abandon a family, all they need to do is leave. Go somewhere else and say you're someone else. If you know Natalie Zeman Davis's very famous book and the movie made from it, The Return of Martin Guerre, deals exactly with this sort of thing. You can be who you want to be. You can really reinvent yourself in a way that's very alien to us. So why do you have to have laws against bigamy? Because people are doing it all the time. Because it's so easy to do. So you just leave. You go somewhere else. So it's the master system, the idea of having a master that keeps people in check and keeps them in control. Masterless men are utterly terrifying to the 18th century. Pirates are masterless men. Highwaymen are masterless men. They live outside of that leash, and that's what makes them scary. So to go back to what I said in the beginning, they become, in the 18th century mind, for a moment, the ultimate figure of demonic terror. Not so much because they are thieves, but because they represent an organized class of masterless men. But they also represent a possibility of what might happen because of the rise of the new economic and legal systems in place. The fear is that you're going to create more and more of this. So as to the extent that they are a reaction to that, they carry a fear, they convey fear because of that. But the notion of masterless men, utterly, utterly terrifying. So that's kind of who these people are. And that's sort of their ambit, their aura. We also need to understand that they are simply mariners and nothing else. All of the symbology that I mentioned before, eye patches, peg legs, are all just the symbols of the sailor. It's very easy to lose your leg at sea. Ropes can take your leg off. Sails, a falling sail. Some of you have spent time on ships. I've spent some time on sailing ships. They are dangerous. And canvases, the canvas gets snapped like that, and if it happens to be 25 feet long and the wind catches it right, it'll take your arm off in a second, easily. So you lose your arm, and then you end up being the cook. So if you see a man with a peg leg, this is exactly what happens on a ship. If you see a man with a peg leg, he can't go up aloft anymore. So he has to do something else. They become carpenters, they become cooks, they get deck jobs. And that's what the symbol is. So you see the old pauper sitting by the sailor's home with a peg leg, and everybody knows that he's a carpenter or a cook. It's not an accident in your Treasure Island that what does Long John Silver sign on the ship as? He's a cook, because he can't go aloft, right? These are 18th century symbols that are played out. So you have a couple different things happening at once. On the one hand, we've got all the symbol of 18th century maritime life, all these issues of the 18th century that are sort of playing themselves out in this discussion. Now, let's talk about what we can say and can't say about them, which is the next thing, about understanding what we know about what we know. Almost everything that we know popularly about pirates comes from a few authors. We have basically 3 or 4 different streams that help us understand who these folks are. One of them are court cases. There are a few court cases, but not a lot. And the court cases and records of the Admiralty, which deal with this as sort of how we're going to hunt people down, how we're going to stop them, and what happens once we catch them, are good but sparse. Excuse me, they're there. There's good information, and so we know the veracity. We know these people exist. Stede Bonny existed. We know of his execution from multiple sources. Edward Teach, we know existed. We have multiple stories of him. We're not so sure about some of the others, because here's the problem. We have the court records. The court transcripts and Admiralty records are great. They happened. That stuff's real. Those transcriptions are real, and when you work with those kinds of documents, you have to confront the problems of, well, what are people saying? There's an issue of memory here. If this person's giving testimony, how does that really correspond to what happened? And that's a standard historical problem, right? We always confront that. We can cope with that. But we also have novels and plays that are contemporary to the pirates that tell us an enormous amount of information about the pirates. And I brought one of these books because it's one of my favorites. I make my students read it even though it's like 800 pages long. Sometimes I've given them, I sometimes try to teach the pirate course in the fall so that I tell them over the summer, read this, because we're never going to talk about it in class. You're never going to come in and have the night where we talk about this book, but this book will be present in every single thing we talk about. So you kind of have to have it as your deep background, and we'll refer to it over and over again. The book is called The General History of the Robberies and Murders of the most notorious pirates, and also their policies, disciplines, and governments, so on and so on, by someone called Captain Charles Johnson. And Captain Charles Johnson tells us unbelievable fine-grained detail about the pirates. He has conversations. He's there as they're making decisions about how to direct their guns. He seems to be there to tell us about how they arrange the deals that they make amongst themselves about the distribution of goods. He's there when they draft charters about who's going to be punished for what kind of crime, how women will not be allowed on ships, how young men will not be allowed on ships, and if either are and are touched, they will be punished by the crew. All this incredible detail. And it's marvelous. It's an unbelievably rich source. He's there, for example, when Edward Teach, the well-known Blackbeard, is drunk at Ocracoke Island in North Carolina with his friends, and he takes 2 of his friends and has his wife have sex with them on the table in his cabin. He's there to see all this stuff. Gives us unbelievable rich detail. Virtually everyone who writes about pirates relies very heavily on this marvelously written, fabulous testimony from Captain Johnson. I was looking at this book earlier today, David Cordringley, which is a very popular book you could read on pirates. A very good one. Doesn't make the strongest argument, but it's a very good, readable overview of what we know about them. And he's talking about Johnson all the time. Johnson's our great source. Here's the problem. Most of us don't think that this Charles Johnson ever existed. There's no maritime record of him whatsoever. So there's no indication, at least as I've been able to see and other people have talked about, that there is a Captain Johnson to do this. It's unclear. Do you know who we think wrote this book? This is where everything starts to fall off the rails. Daniel Defoe. Right. Fortunately, now look, let's repeat this. Let me demonstrate what this is like to do with a class of students. Just don't say a word, right? Daniel Defoe. Right, that's the normal reaction. Right? No. But no, you got it. You understand. And some of you may have even read Gideon Defoe's pirate books. Have you seen these? There's a guy named Gideon Defoe, and that's not an accident, who's writing a series of The Pirates in an Adventure with Charles Darwin. Fabulous books. They're short. And the best thing about the books is, I think he's only written 5, but the book has in the back the list of the 75 books in the series, just so he could say The Pirates in an Adventure with Karl Marx, The Pirates in an Adventure with... Absolutely hysterical. And I honestly think that the entire series of books comes from one joke that's in the first book, The Pirates in an Adventure with Charles Darwin, in which they go into the hold of the Beagle. His little lusty group of pirates go into the hold of the Beagle, and they see that Darwin is bringing all these apes back to Britain, and they conclude that there must be something valuable in the apes. Why else would you carry apes back to England? And so they try to figure out what's valuable about them. They can't figure out, and they start tearing them apart, looking for the gold that must be hiding in the apes. And as they tear these apes apart in a gory but comedically bizarre scene, pieces are flying everywhere, and one of the parrots on the shoulder of one of the pirates keeps on saying, "Pieces of ape, pieces of ape, pieces of..." And I honestly think that is the reason he wrote that book, to just be able to tell that joke, right? He's got a great line where Charles Darwin explains to the pirate chieftain what his mission is, and he says that he has this very controversial theory that's very unpopular, but he really believes it true. And he says, "Well, tell us what the theory is." He says, "My theory is that a monkey, when dressed as a lord and properly shaved, will pass as a member of the English aristocracy." That's his theory. So they're very sardonic books, but. When we have this, the fact that this is Daniel Defoe, the author of Robinson Crusoe, and a number of other plays, this becomes immensely problematic. It's like learning about some horrific, ghastly crime taking place off in the woods in Maine somewhere, and everybody's afraid of it, and then you discover that the person who told you the story is Stephen King. And suddenly you're being told that it's true, but there's now suddenly very good reason to question this. So most of what we know, most of the best stuff that we know about these guys comes not from sources that we're comfortable with. They come from one of the best fiction writers of the era, one of the men who's responsible in the early 18th century of inventing the novel. So the very idea, and this is there's a wonderful book that deals with this fascinating way in which the novel gets invented in the early 18th century. And because the crucial crux of the novel is that I can tell you a lie, but that lie also tells the truth. Now, you can see where I start to get interested because I write about Mason Locke Weems and the cherry tree. Right? So these kind of things they segue together. So there's a certain issue of what's true, what's not true. This is becoming my stock and trade. Fraud, forgery, stuff like this is becoming a lot of what I deal with. But it's a very interesting moment, and one book makes a beautiful connection between the invention of the novel in this time, the idea that there can be a lie, but the lie conveys truth. And I love this work. And you know what that connects to? The invention of insurance, which is also happening in the same time. Because the whole idea of insurance is that it's an inversion of the way value is created. Value is created at the point at which the shovel can now dig the hole. Before that, its value is latent. The shovel has the potential to dig the hole, but it does not do it, therefore it's not valuable. It digs the hole, it becomes valuable. Insurance inverts that policy, inverts that idea, turns it around, that it becomes valuable precisely at the moment of loss. The other thing that's happening in this is the invention of paper currency, which is exactly the same process. Truth in a lie. The paper is not valuable, but you agree that it is. So this one scholar, Ian Balcom, puts all this stuff together in a really creative way to argue that this is all swirling together. The pirates are part of this because pirates are one of those places that we're getting these stories from in a way that the simple borderlines between, well, this is historical and therefore true, and this is novelistic and therefore not true, nobody's really sorted that out yet. You kind of move back and forth. You can kind of play inside of it. So a lot of what we know happens in this moment. The English reading audience, and to a certain extent the American reading audience in this decade, the teens, 17 teens and 1720s, wants to read this stuff. It is salacious. It's fascinating. It touches on their issues, their anxieties about their economy and the worlds that they're confronting, particularly on the American side, where many, I won't say virtually all, but many people had to come across the ocean in order to be in the colonies in the first place. So even though they're not mariners, they're kind of conversant with the sea the way you guys don't build highways, but you're conversant with the highways. You have an awareness of this. They're part of your world. So they're paying attention to this. They're paying this mind. So this stuff is sort of working for them. It ties in. It gives them this feeling. There's a wonderful, if you want to know what it's like to encounter these people, do you know who Richard Henry Dana is? Wrote 3 years before the Mass, this fabulous book from the 1840s, I think, 1830s and 40s, 30s or 40s, about, and he's was he like a law student or something? He's got some kind of relatively, middling job, but I think he was maybe a reporter. He whatever reason, he decides to stop for a little while and go to sea, and he writes this narrative of his time at sea, and it's absolutely, ship enthusiasts live for this book. It's one of the best books of its kind, and there's a moment, and I use it with my students, there's a moment where they're sort of, they're just out at sea, and something comes up behind them, and they're able to see it, and out of curiosity, there's a ship, and you look, and it has no flag. And they determine with great acuity, they're sure, it has no flag. And they get terrified. Those who've read it, you may remember, and they start getting up in the yards and putting every bit of canvas on the ship they have. Everything they can do, they are utterly terrified. And it's a wonderful thing to read. If you want, I could probably post a PDF on my website. You could take a look at it. It's really worth seeing when you think about pirates, because it's the other side. There's nothing funny about this. This is crime. This is crime and murder, and they know this, and they are terrified. Here it's the 1840s, right? It always happens. There's a constant, and yet there's this one group of people that we get really focused on. So part of it, like I say, has to do with this moment in the 18th century, this sort of change in how the economic systems are operating and people's concerns. Some of it has to do precisely because of that worry. There's an explosion in the literature, and because there's an explosion of the literature, it's got to be colorful, otherwise you can't sell the book, right? It's got to be fun. So there's more writing about it, so that suddenly one little group of criminals have great press. Imagine if you were a criminal and you got Daniel Defoe writing about you. That's not bad. That's not a bad press agent. So you're going to get more energy around us, and a colorful literature emerges. And that literature brings together a whole variety of things that really are just about life in the early 18th century. The attire, the style, the language, the violence, which is very much part of 17th and 18th century British life. It's not abnormal. Their horror at the violence in many cases is not our revulsion to it. It's not that we are uncomfortable with physical violence. Most of us are not intimate with it, as we say in Hebrew, Baruch Hashem, thank God, right? That's not our thing, but they are. They confront this much more often. So in many ways, their horror is not the horror of violence, but the horror of, I don't want that to be me. Right? It's kind of a knowing horror. You see this in interesting ways. We were just talking about the film Black Robe, which is an Indian relations film set in the 17th century, but the Jesuit relations, the missionary records that it's based on. There's a wonderful moment, wonderful, not for someone, but where this one group of, I believe, Iroquois Indians are going to execute a guy. They're going to torture them to death. And the Jesuits, who are the priests there, sort of disdainful and say, we want nothing to do with this, we won't go. But their servants, the Frenchmen who travel with them, go to them and say, you mind if we go? We're going to go. And so they go. And so a class issue emerges. The educated elite Jesuits want nothing to do with this. Their working class données, the guys who are sort of their servants, they want to go. Well, why would they want to go? Because they're from rural France. And the execution is a popular public thing. That's a fun time. And maybe they're even a little curious to see how these natives do it a little differently than we did. But it's not an alien thing. So it's a little disingenuousness on the part of these French Jesuits in saying what a horrible thing. It's happening all the time. It's happening all the time in English villages. They see this stuff. They know violence. Very much part of the 18th century and written into this moment in a really important way for us to see. And then the issue sort of fades out and they just stop writing about it. One argument is that the British authorities get much more vigilant about crushing it. The current argument that comes from a historian named Marcus Rediker is that this has to do with the English control over the slave trade. That it's fine to be robbing the Spanish and the French. In fact, it's encouraged. That's not a problem. And 16th and 17th century, have at ye. Go ahead. Knock yourself out. And that's fine. All maritime activity involves theft in the 17th century and in the 16th century. Normal. And even when the countries are at war with each other on the land, when they sign peace treaties with each other, they always append the treaty by saying, however, no peace beyond the line. And the line is the line of the Treaty of Tordesillas, which is when the Pope kind of divided the world up, and partly why we have Portuguese in South America and Spanish as well. But there's a line in the ocean, and that's the other side of the line. So fine, our war is over on the ground at home, but no peace beyond the line. So in other words, you can raid my shipping and I can raid yours. So everybody who goes to sea needs to have the arts of protection. It's a military endeavor. 16th and 17th century, absolutely. The 18th century starts to calm down. down because the British start to put a tighter hand on it. And one argument is that because the slave trade is so phenomenally lucrative, that it's fine when you guys go and raid the Spanish, raid the Dutch, whatever you want to do, knock yourself out. You want to grab some tobacco boats? Have a great time, no problem. As soon as you start interfering with the slave trade, then you have a problem. You've now touched a third rail, as it were. It's too important. This thing is too lucrative, too vital to the way the English Empire is operating to be interfered with. And that's when you start to get a mobilization. By the end of the 1720s, you get a mobilization against these people very powerfully to shut that activity down. And they do shut it down. But they also don't, because it continues on and on and on. It never really ends. It carries on. It just stops getting attention. It just becomes more crime. And crime is part of living life, and there it is. So you see this happening over and over again, but one little group of people, one little moment, roughly 2,000 people, become for us stand-ins for the entire 18th century, the whole of maritime culture, the whole of these issues of legal and cultural transformation in Britain in this moment. And then it gets picked up in the 19th century. It's forgotten for a little while, but Robert Louis Stevenson writes his book. And it becomes popular. And then artists, what's his name, Pye, right, starts to paint. They start getting all these different paintings of this art. This becomes a fetish in the end of the 19th century. And what else is happening in the 19th century? The expansion of the United States into new places, the expansion of the United States, sort of grandying building of a city like this, so that in 1904, 1903, people in Tampa decide they're going to have a parade to celebrate the Panama Canal. It's a celebration of the Panama Canal, and they decide to have a pirate's ball in the midst of this. And year after year, well, that was a fun event. Let's do the Panama Canal parade again. And for a few years, they continue to do this, and the pirate's ball is part of what's happening because they're seeing the art, they're reading the novels, they're hearing the stories. There's all kinds of popular fiction about them. They just kind of reemerge as a figure. And what ends up happening is there's a fight between different people running that event, and one group wins and one group loses, and the Panama Canal sort of fades out of the story, and it becomes what we know as Gasparilla. It becomes the beginning of that process. So the pirate ball comes to sort of eclipse the entire event. It stops being about anything other than that. Perfectly logical thing for them to do. They're just looking at popular culture. It's really not about the 18th century. It's about this remembrance of the 18th century. And so what we end up with then, I'll conclude with this, and then we can take some questions. What we end up with is the next iteration, because our popular culture maker is what? It's the movies, right? It's Hollywood, Disney, right? It's all this stuff in dialogue. So we have some fascinating, weird little things that happen. For example, if we were to, we owe so much to the actor Robert Newton. Some of you know who Robert Newton is, right? The guy who played Long John Silver in the 1952, right? Is it 52, Treasure Island? The character of Long John Silver, and I have to say, Robert Louis Stevenson's a smart writer, and Silver's a really interesting, my issues in the world, Silver's a really interesting choice of a name, a very interesting choice of a name, for two reasons. One of them has to do with piracy. The other would have to do with what? What sensitivity might someone named Levy be concerned about the name Silver? Actually, I have family members named Silver, right? It's a Levitic name. It's a Jewish name. I'm not making an argument that that's what's going on. I am suggesting, though, that the people who create culture, who create art, know this. They know what they're doing. There's an awareness. So you have sort of double layers of alienness for this character, right? He's a pirate. You're also sort of insinuating something else. And I'll tell you something else. If you've read that book, if you would know the answer to this. Where is he from? Do you know where? His accent gives it away. Do you know what he is? He's Irish. And not only is he Irish, but he's what's the guy's name in Batman? What's the chief cop? What's the chief cop's name in the Batman TV show? Commissioner Gordon's uniformed buddy is O'Hara, right? Chief O'Hara. So he's not only Irish, he's a really awkward, embarrassing Faith in Bagura Irish. It's a really silly kind of, caricature of Irishness. Unmistakably Irish. Because he's constantly saying his sentences, well, sure, sure we'll go, and sure, all those really cartoony uses of sure. Here's the problem. Everybody has a different associations with the Irish. In Britain, the maritime accent, the common maritime accent, is from Devon and Cornwall, where the University of Exeter is, in fact. People from Cornwall are understood as being seafarers. So in making the movie, Newton thought instead of doing the Irish accent, which would sort of push it into a different discussion in the 1950s, right after World War II, when, if you remember, the Republic of Ireland left the lights on in Dublin so that the Germans could locate London, right? If you make this villain Irish, then you're saying something sort of creative. Instead, what he did is he took a simple maritime accent, the Cornish accent, and gave his character that accent. And that's why we have this notion of R in our piracy. It's that simple. It's an actor's choice to play a character as Cornish instead of playing him as Irish, which the character actually was written as. So this is how this stuff gets made. So I'll conclude with this, but as you look at this stuff, I want you to consider not just sort of what we know, but how do we know what we know? What streams are going in to make the knowledge that we see? How much is about us? How much is about the other people that have had their time, over centuries in this case, to sort of encrust their own meanings on it that we can then inherit and reconsider? So that's sort of a nice, depressing setup for Gasparilla. And I only have one Gasparilla story. It's a very strange story. My synagogue, or one of my synagogues, is on the route, not on the parade route, but on a couple blocks up. And it's a very, very Orthodox synagogue. And there was one year where we were there, and we were stuck there for the whole of Gasparilla because all these people were going down to Gasparilla. And we're stuck. We're just there. And so all the kids from the synagogue are out front. And they're getting beads thrown at them, and it's this whole array of, and my friend's grandfather, who's passed away since I was saying, of Shalom, is a very aged rabbi who, started yeshiva in Montreal, and he was absolutely horrified. It was a very interesting cultural moment watching this very old Hasidic rabbi sort of be horrified at the iconography of the coins and telling the kids they had to take them off, and it was because it was just a really interesting moment, and sitting there watching and thinking to myself, this is why I live here, right? This is it. This is what Tampa's all about, that I've got this guy who survived the Holocaust taking Gasparilla beads off of children because the symbology on it is inappropriate. I was very happy. That's my world. That's the world I want to be in. I like that. I like those kind of moments. So that's my only Gasparilla story. But why don't you, if you have questions, let me see if I can handle them.